Richard Spencer is opposed to the RAISE Act. Of course, in a vacuum, so am I. The best immigration is no immigration, but Richard is saying he is opposed to the RAISE Act and supports the current immigration system in preference.
And I would be remiss if I were not honest with you and say I do not support this bill. I could even go as far as saying that I would prefer a immigration paradigm that is based on, bringing in peons, bringing in idiots, bringing in guest workers who do these jobs, who don't learn English, who don't culturally assimilate, who are different from the white American nation. Bringing in all of these high IQ Asians could be absolutely devastating to the middle class. And the fact is, do they not count? It's great to protect a blue-collar worker who, for a couple dollars more, would mow lawns, would shuck oysters, would work on agricultural stuff. Yeah, of course we should protect those people. But we should also be protecting whites with 115 IQs who can be a computer programmer.
Richard keeps saying things like, I could even go as far as saying, and I'm opposed to this new paradigm. Okay, opposed to the paradigm. So are you opposed to the bill? I'm going to collapse the possibilities of what Richard Spencer is saying and respond to him as if he clearly and forthrightly stated that he opposes the RAISE Act and supports the status quo in preference as the lesser of two evils. Now, the first thing we should consider is that the RAISE Act would almost certainly reduce the amount of immigration. Tom Cotton, one of the proponents of the bill, says from about 1 million a year to 500,000 a year, and it would prioritize high IQ Asians over low IQ Hispanics and Africans. In addition, high IQ Asian immigrants have fewer kids, so the long-term demographic effect is much less with the RAISE Act than with the status quo. Another thing to consider is that if the RAISE Act is passed, the proportion of immigrants that are European would increase. And there's also a chance that the absolute number of European immigrants would increase as well. Hispanic immigrants would have a greater European admixture to the extent that Hispanics with European admixture tend to be more educated and likely to have the credentials and business skills to get into the U.S. with the RAISE Act standards. And so the Hispanics would almost certainly be more white as well. So from a purely white nationalist standpoint, this all seems to be a very good thing indeed. So the more indirect consequences of high IQ non-white immigrants must be very profound. Richard refers to Canada, but one thing to consider is that Canada's visible minorities actually earn less than European Canadians, even the Koreans, Japanese, and Chinese. So I'm not exactly sure what Richard's argument with Canada is with this. But Richard then talks about the RAISE Act, and he opposes it on two sort of themes of grounds, the cultural and economic. So let's start with the economic arguments. Richard argues that the RAISE Act would be devastating toward middle-class whites after talking about how many high IQ Chinese and high IQ Indians there are.
Let's remember a couple of things. There are 1.2 billion Chinese people. That means that, and I'm just going to do rough back of the envelope, calculations here. That means that there are some 600 million East Asians in China who have IQs above 105. Let's use round numbers. The average IQ for an East Asian, Han Chinese, is 105. Let's go 600 million. Let's say there are 250 million, 250 million Chinese that have IQs in the 115 area. That is a huge pool. There's 1 billion Indians. That is a very different nation, certainly not nearly as homogenous as the Han Chinese. But I could easily say there's 250 million Indians who have IQs in the 115, 130 range. That is, they are definitely able to become professionals, doctors, lawyers, computer programmers, etc. And we can go on. You can actually find tons of Africans. Certainly not as many, but tons of Africans who actually fit that description. That is the first bite out of the apple, the talented, not even the talented 10th, more like the talented one the top 1% of those populations clearly have high IQs and clearly are able to participate in these professional careers. There's a billion people perhaps on Earth who could conceivably come here. Do we really want to imitate Canada, where we preference high IQ, high skilled people, and they come in and they radically transform society?
The problem is you can make the same argument to an even greater degree about low IQ immigrants and say there are around 4 billion people who could potentially want to enter the United States under the current immigration setting, which makes the RAISE Act an improvement over the status quo in this total potential numbers game. And for the economic impact of high IQ immigrants, they'll probably be paying more in taxes than they receive in government benefits and can themselves create capital that would benefit the white working class. By comparison, low IQ migrants would take more in government benefits than they pay in taxes, anywhere from $5,000 to $15,000 a year if the current crop of blacks and Hispanics are any indicator. And they would compete for jobs against the most economically vulnerable whites, and they would not be creating any capital of their own. That, combined with there being more of them and having a greater ability to sway elections, makes the idea that the economic impact of the high IQ migrants would be worse than that of low IQ migrants seem rather crazy. Richard Spencer then makes a very speculative argument regarding the middle class and culture.
Look at Vancouver. Vancouver is a beautiful city, but it is effectively a Chinese city. It does not at all reflect the historic Canadian nation, whether that be Anglo-Protestant or French Catholic or so on, European, white. It does not reflect that at all. Again, if we move down this paradigm and we have 500,000 high IQ people coming into the country, that is going to change the culture. And it arguably might change it at a more rapid pace than the current system that we have now, where we have, random peons who come in and they basically remain in the shadows. We have a lot of illegal immigrants who come, they go, they come again, they go again. This might be more devastating in terms of changing the culture of the United States and what we have now.
It's hard to say what he means by the mid-upper class influencing culture. I don't know if he means direct interaction with the lower class, their presence in the media, or their influence as consumers. Since he didn't specify, I'll just go ahead and address all three, and hopefully one of these is what Spencer meant. For the media presence argument, current mass media is dominated by Jews. If these visibly non-European Chinese and Indians start replacing Jews in media, that's probably a good thing, as their foreignness is more visible. Right? While the Jews in media are European-looking and genetically would be classed as European, but they're functionally an outgroup. And making the outgroup visible is always a good thing. That's one of the reasons they put the star on Jews in Nazi Germany. So if the RAISE Act increases the proportion of visible non-whites in mass media than would have happened under the status quo immigration policy, that may not even be a bad thing. However, it's not really obvious to me that this would even be the case, and I can speculate that higher IQ people don't care as much about race in terms of their media figures, and that high IQ Asians are less insistent on having an Asian actor or an Asian news anchor than the lower IQ blacks and Hispanics are wanting a black or Hispanic actor. But if Spencer is referring to the cultural influence of mid-upper class on the lower classes via direct contact, then having, former mid-upper class people be pushed down economically into closer proximity with lower class people will probably increase their influence on them. And since in terms of direct influence, it probably doesn't have much to do with money, but the fact that high IQ people tend to influence low IQ people and less so the other way around, the effects of pushing mid-upper class whites down economically, down closer to proximity, both residential and employment, will probably increase their influence on the lower class whites. If that's even what Richard Spencer's talking about, which is, it's hard to figure out what he's even talking about. In terms of influence as consumers, and so thus their influence on cultural products, Perhaps the high IQ immigrants would drive media in a more negative direction than the lower IQ immigrants coming in under the current system. But I can just as easily imagine the larger number of low IQ immigrants having a worse effect on culture than the high IQ non-white immigrants. So the cultural argument, it's speculative. It's not immediately obvious that Spencer's speculations that the Raise Act would have a worse cultural effect than the status quo. It's really hard to really evaluate what Richard Spencer's cultural arguments, what there is even really behind it. And again, we're sort of back to clear, direct benefits from the Raise Act versus these highly speculative cultural costs and semi-speculative economic costs. So I want to use this opportunity to hawk an idea that I think is a long time coming, and that is digital closed economies. The end goal being for white nationalists to ultimately produce much of their own goods. I mean, like their own food, their own toilet paper, their own toothpaste, their own furniture, their own houses. The beginning would be something like a simple app that grades companies on a scale of 1 to 10 to how good they are. So when you're shopping, you can just pull out your phone and make sure you're not buying from overtly anti-white companies. For example, the company Kellogg's just pulled all advertising from Breitbart. So we could say, okay, so don't buy anything from Kellogg's. Kellogg's rating would be like a 2. And when we have a list of our guy companies, people can buy things for, online from our guys. And for those who are willing, they can put their business in a listing. And perhaps this list will be hosted by the Right Stuff, American Renaissance, VDare, or wherever. The idea being to create a market for our guy products and a directory for our guy services. And if our guy products and services aren't available, at least we could get services from fellow whites, or sort of as a last resort, buy from a company that at least isn't viciously anti-white. Okay, so we have sort of a priority. Like the first choice is our guy. The second choice is, white mom and pop shop, right? And third choice is a company that isn't viciously anti-white. Now, I get it, a digital closed economy isn't really a reality today, and it's not something that can be built overnight. But if, say, in the future, half of our income remains in the digital closed economy instead of being blown all over the place into the larger economy, that's an enormous advantage for us, and it makes firing people for being open about their politics a bit less effective, and it makes all of this immigration stuff less important. Okay, it makes the idea of the white professionals being crowded out by the Indian or Chinese professional, that's not so much of an issue when we have our own closed economy. But back to Richard Spencer's argument, he's pitting very clear benefits against very speculative costs, possibly based on a misunderstanding of the situation in Canada. And I don't really even agree with his speculation on the economic costs, and I don't even know what his argument is on the cultural costs. And ultimately, we should be moving away from having to deal with these problems anyway through the formation of digital closed economies.